When people talk about adult games, this is almost never what they mean. Sierra Lee is a solo indie game developer whose body of work is almost entirely defined and quietly dismissed by one word: prawn. Once people hear that, their brains shut off and whatever point you were going to make next doesn't matter. And that's unfortunate because while all of her games do contain explicit sexual content, that content is never the most interesting thing about them. This video is going to be a chronological overview of Sierra Lee's works, discussing what they are, what they're trying to do, what works, what doesn't, and why I think several of them are far more worthwhile than they appear on the surface. If you've watched my previous videos on The Last Sovereign or Noblesse Oblige, then congratulations, this is now my third video about adult RPG Maker games. I should probably get a punch card. All of Sierra Lee's games are adult games in the strict sense that they contain explicit sex scenes, but in terms of actual content, those scenes make up a surprisingly small fraction of each game. To put it in concrete terms, you might have a 30-hour RPG that contains fewer than 30 minutes of explicit scenes. That's less than 2% of the total runtime. You've probably spent more time in RPGs reorganizing your inventory. That ratio matters because the overwhelming majority of these games are made up of writing, narrative design, mechanical systems, characters, and themes, the same things we use to judge any other game. Most of the runtime is spent doing normal RPG things like talking politics, managing systems, and fighting monsters, which means if you're here exclusively to get off, you're going to be bored. There's a persistent assumption that games with explicit content are inherently low effort, low quality, and artistically illegitimate. It's not a stereotype for no reason, since in many cases, once that box is checked, the rest of the game often gets neglected by the developers. Mainstream games are allowed to include sex so long as it's incidental. Consider games like Mass Effect or Baldur's Gate 3. Even Gooner games get a pass if they're suggestive but not explicit. Think Stellar Blade or a lot of the Eastern gacha games. There's a narrow Goldilocks zone where sex is allowed, but only if nobody stares directly at it. Once a game crosses into outright prawn, it's usually treated as artistically worthless. Sierra Lee's works sit uncomfortably in that space. Her games are character-driven, writing-heavy, ambitious, and thematically serious, while also being unapologetically explicit. That combination makes them difficult to market, but also genuinely interesting. Tonally, her games tend to mix lighthearted or goofy surface premises with stories that take their own world seriously. Tropey setups and genre cliches are treated as if they were real, coherent worlds with consequences. Sometimes that realism is grounded and thoughtful, sometimes it's messy, but it's never lazy. Being a solo indie dev, Sierra Lee uses freely available tools like RPG Maker for her RPGs, Ren'Py for visual novels, and royalty or copyright-free music for her soundtracks. The production values are limited, but she's a master chef who makes the best of her ingredients, and the games are priced accordingly, often becoming outright bargains during sales on Steam. And because she's a one-woman act, she has complete creative control. There's no committee or focus group to say, maybe we shouldn't let the player have sex with a swarm of bees. One consistent downside across her catalog is overly obtuse or poorly explained systems. Vague progression paths, unclear interactions, and hidden content aren't always clearly communicated to the player, which can create a frustrating reliance on guides and wikis if you're not willing to stumble around blind. Before getting into the individual games, it's worth addressing The Last Sovereign, Sierra Lee's magnum opus. The Last Sovereign first became publicly available in early access around 2015, with development largely wrapping up with its post-game update in 2025, meaning Sierra Lee actively worked on the game for roughly 10 years. It's a massive, roughly 180-hour RPG, and it's completely free. I've already made a dedicated video about it, so I won't dwell on it here. The fact of the matter is The Last Sovereign is easily her best work by a wide margin, so if you're only going to try one Sierra Lee game, that should be it. Sierra Lee also collaborated on other game projects long ago and far away with different levels of involvement, but I haven't played any of those, and this video is focused exclusively on the games she personally developed. With that said, let's get started. Ouroboros is our first game released in November 2016. It's roughly 6 hours long and only costs $5. It's a traditional turn-based RPG set in a medieval fantasy world. An evil mage has taken over the castle, kidnapped the princess, and the hero must rescue her. So, you know, it's Tuesday. The central gimmick of Ouroboros is it's set in a Groundhog Day-style time loop. It's easy to spoil, so I'll keep the details minimal, but the short version is, the world is an illusion, most of its inhabitants are not real, and the true objective isn't rescuing the princess, but rather escaping the loop. The protagonist begins the game with amnesia and gradually regains his knowledge over repeated cycles. Importantly, he's the only one whose memories and abilities persist between loops. That design choice makes progression feel closer to a knowledge-based game like Outer Wilds. Once you understand what to do, each loop becomes faster and more efficient. The game does a good job respecting the player's time. Repeated segments can be skipped or sped up, so the loop never becomes tedious. One of my favorite examples of time travel feeding into gameplay is the town wishing well that gives you a tiny stat boost when you toss a coin in, only for the game to later acknowledge the hero has done this millions of times across the different loops, retroactively granting you a massive power increase. Part of breaking the loop involves restoring the hero's 3 companions to their original selves. Their personalities have been altered by the illusion, and watching those changes revert are some of the game's funnest character moments. Structurally, the game is non-linear, with branching paths and multiple endings culminating in the true ending once all objectives are complete. Combat is standard turn-based RPG fare, functional, unremarkable, and thankfully free of grinding due to the time loop mechanic. For a 6-hour game, Ouroboros feels exactly as long as it should be. It introduces its ideas, explores them, and ends before they wear out their welcome. The sexual content is easily the weakest part of the game. Unlike Sierra Lee's later games, the not safe for work content in Ouroboros feels crowbarred in. The art is simple, cartoony, visually flat, and it's tonally jarring. Suddenly being asked by a fairy to sleep with her in what otherwise felt like a fairly standard fantasy RPG gave me whiplash. It's like someone remembered the Steam tags at the last second and whispered, "Hey, shouldn't this be horny?" They're not terrible, but they add almost nothing, and the game would lose very little if they were gone. My verdict: Ouroboros is good, compact fun, and absolutely worth its $5 price tag. A strong first outing. Crimson Grey was released in July 2017. It's approximately 3 hours long and costs $10. It's the odd one out in Sierra Lee's catalog, being the only visual novel and also the most grounded and contemporary setting. The premise is simple. What would a yandere girlfriend be like in the real world? For those not familiar, a yandere is a character, usually female, defined by obsessive love taken to violent extremes. Crimson Grey asks, what psychological conditions might actually produce someone like that, and what kind of person would end up in a relationship with them? Imagine the girlfriend who really loves you, but wants to chain you up in her basement so you're all hers. If you so much as glance at another woman, she'll stab her and you. It's the kind of relationship where communication is important, but what's more important are witnesses. You play as John, a high school student suffering from severe depression. He lives a bleak, colorless life and has no real support system. Enter Lizzie, who brings warmth and affection, and is also deeply unstable. The story unfolds through branching choices, and you're likely to hit multiple bad endings before reaching the good ones. Those failure states aren't just punishment, they deepen the tone and characterization of Lizzie. Restarting is painless as you're able to fast forward through previously read text. The game offers to make things easier after each failure, although I'm not exactly sure what that does mechanically. There's a major reveal by the end of the game that didn't fully land for me, feeling a bit campy, but the writing and character dynamics are strong enough that it didn't derail the experience. There are only 2 adult scenes in the entire game, one of which is missable. They're decently written, mildly titillating, and loosely reinforce Lizzie's state of mind, but they're also largely unnecessary. The game would have still worked without them. My verdict? Recommended. Short, focused, and worth the price. Before moving on, a brief word on the sequel, Crimson Grey: Dusk and Dawn. It costs $5, half the price of the original, which feels like the game acknowledging its real worth. It's told from Lizzie's perspective, and while hearing her internal monologue is mildly interesting, there simply isn't much story left to tell. The characters were already fully explored in the first game, and the sequel adds little value. This is, in my opinion, Sierra Lee's weakest game, and I don't recommend it. It's not offensively bad, just unnecessary. Desecration of Wings was released in March 2018. It's a turn-based RPG set in a medieval fantasy world ruled by immortal aristocrats and populated by various winged humanoid races. It's approximately 12 hours depending on how much side content you engage with, and costs $15. The protagonist, Falana, is somewhat of a black sheep. She's a prostitute, historian, and single mother. By day she works in a brothel, by night she studies forbidden ancient artifacts. Researching the world's previously long-dead civilization is outlawed, and uncovering the reason why forms the core of the plot. On paper, this is a perfectly fine setup. In practice, I think Desecration of Wings fails. Combat is standard turn-based fare, but unlike Sierra Lee's other RPGs, this one features grinding, and worse, you have to level up individual pieces of equipment, requiring you to use subpar gear repeatedly to make them viable, swapping items on and off characters, and wasting time. It's busy work, easily the game's worst system, and an impediment to timely progress. Progression is mostly linear until the late game, when you unlock open-world airship travel. Unfortunately, late-game progression is confusing, with obscure locations and unclear objectives tempting the use of online guides. Sex work is portrayed with relative nuance, neither glamorized nor demonized, but the game ultimately has little to say about it. It feels like just an excuse for the spicy scenes. Falana initially has a strained relationship with her adult daughter due to her line of work. The women in this world choose what they do largely because they have no better options given their class differences and the racial caste system. Falana isn't thrilled about it, but she doesn't see herself as a victim either. Some days she serves abusive clients, some days she enjoys her work. Most of the time she acts like a rational academic, tending to view things pragmatically and treats her work as just a job. The nuance is appreciated even if the game doesn't know what to do with it. There are many spicy scenes, but few are particularly good, and asset reuse is rampant. Specifically, there are only a handful of art variations for the side content, which has to support more than 20 different scenes. They often feel like fan service for the sake of fan service. Desecration of Wings' biggest problem is that it feels half-baked. There's a sense you're playing a first draft, which especially pervades later sections of the game. The plot frantically rushes toward the end as if an entire middle act is missing. Characters change allegiances without much build-up, major reveals fail to land, having no real impact. One character presents as physically transgender, but the game does nothing meaningful with the idea, making it feel like shallow kink inclusion rather than an interesting personality to explore. When I initially played through Sierra Lee's catalog, I didn't pay attention to the release order, opting to play whatever struck my fancy in the moment. After finishing Desecration of Wings, I was surprised to learn it wasn't her first game. I suspect she ran out of resources and had to wrap up development earlier than planned. Having played The Last Sovereign first, it was interesting to see how a lot of story and gameplay concepts germinating in Desecration of Wings would go on to be refined and improved in her later games. My verdict? Not recommended even at its price, though it contains interesting ideas. Don't Save the Princess is an unfinished free browser-based demo released in May 2021. I've included it here purely for the sake of completeness. It's described as a 2D anti-runner where your job is to slow down a Mario-like dunce whose one singular brain cell tells him to rescue Princess Plum, a Princess Peach lookalike who would rather spend time being quote-unquote kidnapped by her dark and brooding Otome villain suitor. Finally, a game brave enough to ask, what if Mario's the problem? There's little content available and no adult scenes yet. Given how long ago the demo first released, I'm skeptical the game will ever be finished. It's mildly amusing if you like runners and maybe worth an hour or two if you're curious, but that's it. Once Ever After is Sierra Lee's second best game after The Last Sovereign. It's easily her most polished and has the highest production values. With a price tag of $25, the game should last you around 30 hours depending on how much side content you explore. Released in October 2022, it's a turn-based RPG set in a multiverse of twisted fairy tales. The protagonist, Ingrid, begins as a hypersexualized version of Little Red Riding Hood, blissfully unaware of her artificial reality until trespassing travelers from another world grant her self-awareness. Thus begins a multiverse-hopping adventure to discover the world's true nature and confront sinister cosmic forces. The game subverts and parodies many fairy tales and their tropes while taking its characters seriously. It features fairly typical turn-based RPG fare, although the combat is smooth and has the best gameplay in Sierra Lee's catalog. There are no invisible random encounters, and while you're not forced to grind, enemies do respawn. Near the beginning of the game, you're given optional cheat items that, while not making you outright invincible, effectively set the difficulty to game journalist mode, I mean easy mode. I've done 2 playthroughs and I'd suggest not using them. The combat is actually somewhat fun and presents rewarding challenges to overcome. The cheat items trivialize it, and equipping them also removes a few optional late game bosses. The biggest mechanical flaw is the archetype system. While characters do level up normally, they also have archetypes, essentially character classes, that have to be separately leveled and can only be equipped one at a time. Each party member has one primary archetype that grants them their best stat bonuses, so while you're busy leveling up other archetypes, they're effectively handicapped. Some archetypes only have a few abilities, while others can take significant time to fully level. It's not always clear how useful an ability is before you get it, and many valuable ones are hidden until you acquire their prerequisite. This makes the whole system feel tedious and incentivizes grinding. The world eventually opens up into a confusing web of interdimensional portals and optional side content. The portals look similar to each other, and it can be difficult to remember which portal leads where or even where they're located in the first place. I often consulted the wiki during my playthrough to figure out where to go next and where to find hidden quests. Narratively, the story is compelling but slightly unfocused. The dialogue and chemistry between characters are great. That said, it's often unclear what your long-term goal is. There isn't a straightforward antagonist or objective for most of the game. The ending resolves most plot threads but leaves Ingrid's character arc feeling incomplete. Still, I enjoyed the story despite those quibbles. If you couldn't tell yet by the character designs, sexuality is deeply integrated into the setting and themes and is more overt than in any of Sierra Lee's other games. Rather than defeating some big bad, Ingrid's primary dilemma throughout the game is coming to terms with her own identity, deciding whether to reject or embrace her sexual nature. The other characters are genuinely compelling as well, the main party in particular. However, the number of alleged main characters who exist almost exclusively to give exposition, dispense quests, or briefly engage in perverted liaisons was a big letdown for me. 3 of the characters who even appear on the main menu fall into those superficial roles. And speaking of the sex scenes, they're by far the best out of all of the Sierra Lee games. They've got high quality art and are plentiful, although oddly clustered. Once you get past the early game, there are huge gaps between scenes, followed by a bunch of them in rapid succession when you enter the late game. It feels like feast followed by famine and then suddenly a buffet. I'd have preferred they were more evenly spaced throughout the game's runtime. My verdict? Highly recommended. If you usually turn your nose at RPG Maker games, this is one that might change your mind. Here's my ranking from best to worst. The Last Sovereign at number 1 obviously, followed by Once Ever After in second, then Ouroboros, and finally Crimson Grey. The other games are interesting, but I wouldn't recommend them. Sierra Lee is a genuinely talented writer whose work deserves more attention than it gets. These games aren't ignored because they're poorly made, but because explicit sex short-circuits a lot of people's willingness to take a work seriously. Her games are ambitious, well-written, thoughtful, subversive, and sincere. I'm not optimistic her audience will ever grow as large as she deserves, but there's real value here, not in spite of the spicy content label, but alongside it, for anyone willing to take these games seriously. And if you are, you'll find something genuinely special waiting for you. Well, apparently this is my brand now, so let me know, what spicy RPG Maker game should I play next? Give me your recommendations in the comments.